I'm Chaz Kalenda, and I'm running to be the next Rhode Island Attorney General. I've practiced law for the last 16 years, 12 of them in the office of the Attorney General, so I have the knowledge and experience to do that job at a high level. I'm not here to fight for a political agenda. I'm not here to fight for a special interest. I'm here to fight for the rights of every Rhode Islander, no matter where you come from or no matter what your background is. I'll need your votes on September 13th for the primary election and November 8th for the general election. If you have any questions about where to vote or how to vote, please contact your local Board of Canvassers or the Secretary of State's office or website. I'm not running to be just another politician. I'm running to be a public servant who can serve as a much-needed check and balance on the state of Rhode Island to root out the corruption both inside and outside of our system. We need your support. You can visit my website at chas4ag.com to learn more about me, donate, or volunteer your time. I'm Chaz Kalenda, and I approve this message.
To take home the Golden Gloves, you've got to put in the work, and you've got to be tough as nails. Ashley Kalis was driven to achieve. Today, Kalis is still fueled by that same hope, grit, and determination. A mother of 3 school-aged boys and successful business owner who ran testing and vaccination sites across the state. Kalis is the fighter Rhode Island needs right now because it's time for a change. Ashley Kalis for governor.
Welcome back to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining the program, my name is Irina Zuckerman, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. With us today, we have a special guest, Dr. Jonathan Matusits, who is an expert in counterterrorism, in terrorism, and communications. He's authored a number of books, 8 academic volumes on terrorism and on communications. Last year's edition focused on communications in global jihad, and since then he's actually managed to publish 2 more. That's quite astonishing, actually. The topic today will be centered around the communications in a terrorist context, but I'd like to start with Dr. Matusits by having you introduce yourself a little bit to the audience. How did you get into this line of work, and what is it like discussing these security related topics in the academia in Florida?
Good evening. Thank you for having me. To answer your question, I would say that the September 11th, 2001 terrorist attacks were the massive motivator just for my interest in terrorism research. I mean, it's been over 21 years. My doctoral dissertation was on the subject of terrorism, and I've been writing, like I said, 8 books on the subject. I have been teaching those classes for about 10 years, and given the current atmosphere in academia, it hasn't been easy. So I have to watch what I say, and I even have to watch what I write. It's not fair, but it is what it is. And the book that's the focus of your show today is Communication in Global Jihad, and it was published last year by Outrage. a major publisher in New York. And the main premise of the book is that the more effective the social media, the more effective the communication in global jihad. And what do we mean by communication in global jihad? Social media, social networking sites, online instructional videos, just mission statements, the terrorist group's mission statements published online, or propaganda videos, just attacking the West, attacking fellow Muslims. So the word communication is an overarching concept. It is vague, which is good because it encompasses a lot of things.
I find this fascinating. The reason why I was quite excited about tackling this particular topic is because right now the Supreme Court is reviewing several cases related to Section 230, which would remove legal protections from major social media companies and essentially allow litigants to sue and for these companies to be held legally liable for third-party content, such as ads, promotions of extremist rhetoric or content, things of that sort. And these two lawsuits involve two different individuals who were killed by ISIS in various attacks in different points in time. It's not, obviously we don't know yet the outcome of these procedures, but both the Democrats and the Republicans have been pushing this measure for different reasons. The Democrats were saying that the social media sites get away with with allowing terrorists to proliferate online, while the Republicans claimed that Section 230 provides a free speech exception and essentially allows censorship. What will happen next remains to be seen, but this brings us back right to this topic, the communication online and how these cases, they can actually change the reality of social media for millions of people, millions of users. Will that actually change anything for the terrorists remains to be seen. So in that regard, I wanted to ask you about your methodology, because there are many different types of terrorist jihadists. They constantly evolve. The jihadist groups break away, they fight with each other, and they change names to avoid scrutiny. They do all sorts of things. What was the focus of your work, and how did you figure out which communications and how to basically trace them or study them for your subject?
I don't believe in censorship,
Mm-hmm.
but if it's for counter-terrorist purposes, I can see why Democrats and Republicans are joining forces to keep their feet to the fire, especially the feet of those social media giants. Logistically speaking, I don't know how they're going to do it. What I can tell you, to answer your question, what I wrote in my book is that once a terrorist group gets censored on social media, for example, their profiles or their accounts get shut down, they just create another account right away. And like you said, they can change names, they can circumvent problems, they can have a pseudonym. So the problem with terrorism, it's patient. It's patient, it's creative, it's versatile. So I don't think terrorist groups are afraid of social media censorship. They will find other ways online to reach out to various audiences, their own constituents or enemy audiences, perhaps the Ummah, which is the global Muslim community, or the non-Muslim world. So I don't think that the new policy that the Senate wants to put in place will be a deterrent to jihadist and terrorist groups. And it's for the United States only. Right now, and this is the book I'm writing right now, book number 9, on jihad in sub-Saharan Africa. Good luck, governments of Africa, trying to censor social media in Africa. It is not working. Sub-Saharan jihadist groups have been so successful roping in people to join their ranks and to radicalize, to become killing machines, thanks to digital media and those instructional videos and those propaganda videos. So there, like in Nigeria, there was some type of censorship because people were getting too violent as a result of online social media communications. But that censorship aggravated the situation. So that doesn't mean it's going to work. I understand the decision by the US Senate, but is that going to work? They're going to find other ways.
So we are seeing this problem that social media facilitates echo chambers. It facilitates and amplifies, its algorithms amplify content which could be used for the good or for evil. And when a society is already facing internal problems, as with the sub-Saharan African countries, ranging from corruption to sectarian conflicts to economic issues to, you name it, all sorts of other internal issues, it's very easy to it's very easy to deceive, manipulate, or otherwise attract followers.
Yes.
Looking at Western societies, they're more stable. There is more opportunities for education and countering disinformation spread by terrorist networks. Nevertheless, at the peak of ISIS recruitment, we saw that a number of young people, not all of Muslim backgrounds, by the way, have ended up joining that organization. Some of them converted to Islam and joined ISIS. And some of them were recruited online, others met local counterparts in person, but regardless, we see that the targets of these campaigns can be diverse. How do we figure out who is at risk and what measures to take to protect the particularly vulnerable people? An average person is not going to fall for terrorist rhetoric, but specific targets will.
Again, I don't believe that censorship is the solution. Education, in the last chapter of the book, focuses on solutions. What can we do to curb that problem? We will never eradicate the problem because the number of jihadists is growing every week. If you look at the jihadists and the sympathizers, it's in the hundreds of millions out of a 2 billion Muslim population. So what can we do to protect those vulnerable minds? Is education the solution? See, the data is contradictory. Some people say that soft power, instead of using hard power like machinery and military invasions, maybe education and activism would be soft power, education being one of them. Soft power could be a solution, but some people say that some of the most dangerous terrorists were the most educated. Osama bin Laden had a degree in engineering. Mohammed Atta, the ringleader of the 9/11 attacks. Mohammed Atta was the oldest. He was from Egypt. He had a PhD. So is education the best barrier, right? The best buffer between terrorist recruiters and potential victims of terrorism? Some people say yes, some people say no. So I think that the best remedy really is your family background, because the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. If you come from a background that values liberalism and respect for others, unlike someone who comes from a radical background that teaches hatred, like in the case of jihad, that teaches hatred of the infidels, so that would be people like us, and the apostates, that would be most Muslims, because most Muslims don't believe in killing people. So they're considered apostates. So if you come from a cultural background or a family background that's radical, you are more likely to be radical. Conversely, if you come from a family background that's more liberal, that's more accepting and tolerant, you will likely turn out to be so.
Well, a number of the targets by various terrorist groups did not necessarily come from extremist backgrounds of any sort, but they were disaffected. They were not particularly engaged with their families, communities. They had some level of education, but they were not inoculated specifically against extremist content. They may have had some level of science knowledge or financial knowledge or whatnot, but they certainly did not have the social skills or the preparation for manipulation and deception that would have prevented them from getting drawn into these cult-like associations. So
That's the task of the community and the
Mhm.
family and friends and relatives, to inoculate them.
In Europe, we have seen a great deal of effort towards preventative prophylactic measures in working with communities at risk, not just specifically radicalized communities, but communities with high level of crimes or poverty or so forth, to prevent their young people from being recruited and to prepare the families to see the signs of someone at risk. To what degree would you say that has been a success?
It's definitely more successful than trying to rewire someone who's been radicalized already. So changing the mind of someone who's killed people already or who has been radicalized by groups like ISIS is more difficult than what you're suggesting. So prevention is better than cure. So preventing radicalization through the development of social skills and the nurturing of Western values and democratic values is, in my opinion, the best cure.
7 years after the peak of ISIS recruitment, we have seen that the group has shifted from the Middle East more towards African states that are more destabilized, but even in Iraq and Syria, it's making a comeback not through territorial control, but through terrorist attacks. Despite the theory was that once ISIS lost ground in the Middle East, once it was vanquished, once it was exposed for all of its social inherent problems and its propaganda was aired, that it would put an end to its successful recruitment elsewhere. However, it did not happen. It is growing by leaps and bounds in various parts of Africa. It's working with affiliates, it's working with local terrorist organizations, and it's capitalizing and evolving its tactics. In some cases, it's more focused on civilians. In other cases, it targets more government institutions, but nevertheless, it finds a way to continue growing. Why did this theory that depriving propaganda of its power did not work? Why did the populations in Africa did not see through its harm, damage, futility after the seeming victories in Iraq and Syria?
Great question. To answer your question, I remember the mainstream media establishment around 2019, about 3 years ago, extolling the virtues of counter-terrorism units. You know, we dismantled ISIS and they lost a lot of territories in the Near East, in Iraq, in Syria. What they did not realize is that ISIS is more dangerous than ever, because like you said, they have spread to other parts of the world, and today they're all over sub-Saharan Africa. They influenced local jihadist groups that are growing and growing, again, thanks to social media, thanks to digital media, the World Wide Web. State failure, like most of the sub-Saharan states, have corrupt government with people living in abject misery. So failed states with their corruption, with their poor infrastructures, allow groups like ISIS to thrive. So before the coalition forces and the local Middle Eastern armies fought ISIS to try just to dismantle them, ISIS was mostly there, right? Their caliphate in Mosul and in Syria. right, in Raqqa.
Mhm.
So I'm not sure that just basically destroying the castle of cards that ISIS was in the Near East was a good idea, because now they're all over. They're more dangerous than ever.
But why is the power of the communication still working even after they were dismantled? Why is anyone listening to them?
I'm not sure that no one is listening to them. When you say no
No,
one, you
why
mean the
is
local
anyone?
people,
Why is anyone listening to them?
people like us, like people who want to fight them, or the local people who are vulnerable?
No, my question is, after it became obvious that they lost, that they didn't build their caliphate in the Middle East, and that they were not reaching even their own people, right? And they had internal problems of various sorts. How did this obvious internal disillusionment, why did it not carry over? Why are they successful at continuing recruitment after their major failure in that respect?
We're talking about major failures from the past. I mean, they're so successful again on the African continent. So what happened in the past, like internal rife, internal struggle, disagreements, doesn't matter anymore. They're so influential, they're so pragmatic still in some parts of the world, like sub-Saharan Africa, the Sahel region, the Congo, that they have multiplied exponentially. They have just churned out so many killing machines there that they could have their caliphate in Africa. Sure, their caliphate in Mosul and Raqqa failed, but they're going to have their caliphate in Africa. We're talking about tens of millions of local Africans who could potentially become jihadists within the next decade. I bet you that the ISIS caliphate, or I should say the ISIS type caliphate, will be in Africa. Once there is a problem somewhere, it shifts elsewhere. And ISIS is the perfect illustration of that. So their communication is working. Their propaganda is working. Their recruitment is working. Their radicalization is working. Look at numbers. And Africans are increasingly digital natives. So they're digital natives because they're young Generation Z folks, and they know how to use social media. They understand mobile media. If you look at Kenya, for example, it is one of the most wired countries in Africa. And Kenya has a huge Al-Shabaab problem. And Al-Shabaab is another jihadist group that has been a Jedi master of using online social media. If you remember what happened almost 10 years ago, the Westgate attack in Kenya, do you remember that? In Nairobi? They tweeted live what they were doing. I mean, they slaughtered over 50 people, including 5 military people. And 10 years later, they're just as good as ever.
So what is the problem with the anti-terrorist forces? Why are their digital operations not nearly as effective in countering this propaganda and dismantling the appeal of this rhetoric?
Very good question. And this is basically the last chapter of the book I'm currently writing, the one I was telling you about some 20 minutes ago about jihad in sub-Saharan Africa. Like you said, counterterrorism units do not wise up to digital media-driven jihad, and they need to do that. Why? We're not sure. And I asked a few questions. So let me rephrase the main question. Why is anti-terrorism not as digitally smart or technologically smart or internet-wise as jihadist groups? I don't think anybody knows that, but that's a fact. They're not as good as jihadist organizations.
Well, that raises a question. Who should be doing this digital fighting? Should it be the counterterrorism military units operating in hotspots? Should it be
definitely
directly on the ground, you would say, not some overarching State Department structure, for instance, you would say, not, or some...
Are you talking about our State Department?
Or
we
any
could definitely
ministry.
Provide African governments with cyber training. See, the thing is that going back to the issue of sub-Saharan Africa, it has been largely ignored. That's where the biggest problem with jihad and terrorism is right now. It's in sub-Saharan Africa, and yet it has been largely ignored. So that's a big problem that hasn't been discussed. It has been ignored.
Now, we have seen growth of terrorist groups, not just in sub-Saharan Africa, but also in Southeast Asia, as Muslim Brotherhood types ideology has shifted from the Middle East and into those areas. There, the governments are more functional and certainly than sub-Saharan countries, but in a number of them, we are seeing still a great deal of struggle with countering extremism before it turns into a violent, into a most violent form. And it seems to me that there is almost a whack-a-mole approach to all of this. We designate some group, it resurfaces under some other name, finds other avenues for its financing, continues recruiting members, continues inciting tensions, continues polarizing the population. The more it polarizes the population, the more there is a backlash from the other side, the more it, there's this cycle of radicalizing followers by creating this antagonistic relationship with local populations. We see it everywhere. That's what terrorists do. They thrive on creating enemies and scapegoats and pitting people against one another. Clearly, this is something to watch out for. Clearly, there's been calls by governments to moderate it, but in some cases, the state structures are the ones feeding into this ideology, or in some cases, directly financing some of these groups. How do we deal with the communications that are backed by state actors and not just?
Yeah, it's very difficult because the Southeast Asian situation is a little bit like our situation. Think about all the conspiracy theories that emerged during the pandemic regarding the vaccine, regarding those topics. It's a lot of it is happening in Southeast Asia, which means that controlling and regulating the internet is very difficult over there. So there's nothing much that state structures, as you mentioned, or governments can do to fight that. And like you said, a lot of the terrorist groups in that region want people just to pit against each other. So they want to create chaos. They don't like order. See, terrorist groups only like their order, right? They only like their organizational structure. And online social media and digital media in general have been excellent. They have been a great platform and vehicle for terrorist groups to create chaos by spreading propaganda, by getting people against each other, by getting democracy to work against itself. Can we control it? No. And then there's another problem, Irina. Going back to what you said about internet regulation, or keeping social media companies keeping their feet to the fire. Imagine this is happening. So imagine the Senate manages to get legislation passed whereby social media companies will have to provide information about certain types of profiles. Do you know what's going to happen? They're going to circumvent that problem by using, for example, the deep web. See, what we're doing right now, it's a Zoom interview, is the surface web. So it's the open internet. Anybody can get to it. We're talking about 4 billion out of 8 billion people who can do it. But there's a significant minority of internet savvy people, a lot of whom are in Africa, a lot of whom are in the Middle East, a lot of whom are here, a lot of whom are in Southeast Asia, who know how to use overlay networks. And overlay networks require more profound knowledge of the internet. It's not based on readily available open source software. You can use more difficult software, which means that jihadist and terrorist propaganda will be easily spread, it will be diffused, and the government, and no government can do anything about it. They're going to use the deep web. That's what's going to happen. And they will be able to spread online terrorist magazines and how to make a bomb in the kitchen of your mom, stuff like that.
So some of these tried and true terrorist mechanisms still work, they're classics. Others have evolved and changed over time. What would you say is new about jihadist communications?
Oh, it's fast, it's global, it's free, it's low cost, it's cheaper, free. It works. It works. The number of jihadists today is a lot higher than what it was 30 or 40 years ago. Sure, the planet is a lot bigger.
Sure.
So the number of people is a lot bigger. The number of Muslims worldwide is a lot bigger. But the efficiency of jihadist communications is amazingly it's extraordinary. It works.
Let's talk about the mercenary jihadists, people who are not necessarily true believers or ideologically inclined, but who need money or who have a particular skill set and who are willing to do anything if you pay them and take care of them.
So they're hitmen. Are you talking about hitmen?
No, I'm talking about mercenary groups that migrate from one conflict to another without necessarily being. Not all of them are even ideological. They don't care.
But they're not jihadists then. They don't have an ideology or a belief system. Are they terrorists? Terrorists or mercenaries?
But they work with the jihadists as basically providing work, and they advance their goals. We have seen some of the militias, for instance, Syrian militias, migrate to Libya and elsewhere. And in Libya, they joined with the true believers, the radicalized factions, and certainly helped them a great deal. And the same thing happened back home in Syria and so on and so forth. So what about those people?
So perhaps the internet doesn't really matter there because the people you're referring to provide the logistics and the weapons and perhaps the funds, I mean, the manpower, the wives, I mean, the sex slaves and all that. I mean, the Toyota pickup trucks. Sure. So perhaps digital media does not matter as much. But it's a bonus to those terrorist groups in countries like Libya. Again, another failed state. Can you think of a single organized country, not a failed state, but the total opposite, where jihadist groups thrive? See, there's a huge correlation between systematic state failure and jihadism. Syria, Iraq, and most sub-Saharan countries.
I would actually go back to Iran. It has huge problems.
It's happening right now, so we have to talk about it.
yeah, Iran, but it's not a failed state in the sense that its bureaucracy is fully functional and it does not lie in complete chaos overall. Yes, it has temporary protests. Sometimes they go on for as long as a month, or more. But overall, it is not compared to, for instance, Afghanistan, where the state does not have control over territory. So in that sense, it is not a failed state. And moreover, it has weaponized militia groups and proxies. So they are kind of quasi-paramilitary groups of jihadists that are under state control and spread their own propaganda, but ultimately answer to Tehran. So this is a different hybrid model of terrorism that we are seeing that has state level approval, state level goals. It's almost a more successful vision of caliphate, because the Muslim Brotherhood inspired caliphates, they're all different, they're all vaguely defined, and I have not yet seen a concrete governance model from anybody. But Iran seems to have it thrives, it creates failed states, but it has at least a coherent model of how to make use of it.
Well, Iran, especially the IRGC, for example, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, they have been designated as a terrorist organization by a few Middle Eastern countries and by the United States.
And I've heard it in Canada now.
Oh, Canada, yeah, Justin Trudeau, that's right. Justin Trudeau just gave a talk. It's not official yet. I think he gave a press conference. I'm not sure if it's official yet. I know that some of the top members of the Iranian government went to Canada, but they have like a suspicious background. I mean, Canada is worried about Iranians moving there. Most of them are fine, but then you have a few of them that can cause trouble.
Sure.
But to answer your question, Iran is the perfect example of state terrorism. And when was the last time there was a real terrorist attack in Iran? It's very difficult to have a terrorist group in Iran going to a mosque or going to any public place and wreak havoc because of the clouts that the Iranian government and the IRGC have on the entire population. And there's something that the media establishment needs to address a little bit more, okay? The government and the IRGC own almost everything in Iran. Businesses, industries, the infrastructure, the airports, the ports. The IRGC has over $300 billion in revenues, most of which goes for military expenditures. So Iran has the capability of fomenting jihad in other places, in other countries. And we know they fund Hezbollah in Lebanon. They probably, we don't know that for sure, but they probably fund the Taliban in Afghanistan. They probably fund other jihadist groups, you know, in the nearby region or elsewhere. So Iran, and I'm talking about the government, the powers that be, Iran is a very dangerous country for that.
Now,
You were talking about the protests. I like what you said, Irina. You said the protests, they come and go. I don't like it when the media calls it a revolution.
yes, exactly.
No,
This is not
a revolution.
These are protests.
Not a
You can call them
revolution.
riots, you can call them uprisings.
It's not even a matter of semantics. It's this is civilian unrest 5.0. We had the one in 2009, and then we had the one in 2011, and then we had the water and oil crisis. So this is probably the fifth one, and I feel for them. I'm all behind the Generation Z, and we know the outrage. I totally understand the outrage. They're brave. Those young people, they're brave. They take to the streets. They get killed, but they're not going anywhere. I want them to go somewhere. The problem with what's going on in Iran right now is what I just mentioned. The government and the IRGC own almost everything. Businesses, unless you work for a bazaar, you're a little business person, but that doesn't count. I'm talking about the oil industry and everything. So what can you do against that? What can you do against such a badonkadonk? That's the first reason. Number two, the Iranian government shut down the internet. So how can you foment a revolution if you have no access to social media? Sure, you can use cell phones, and you can do word of mouth. So some 80 cities have seen civilian unrest. But if you have no access to the media, especially social media, how can you foment a revolution?
To what extent would you say a lot of this internet-based content comes from with some level of state backing? Because as you can imagine, whether you're Iran or some other country similarly with the similar ideology, as soon as you are able to, you want to start controlling the jihadist groups. You don't want them turning on you for, you know, as a way of getting to power, and you certainly don't, you want to advance your own agenda with their help. What extent do you think there is Iranian or other state-backed cooperation between the jihadist groups we see online and state structures?
It all depends on the type of jihadist groups. I know that the Iranian state was fighting ISIS. So the same Shia-Sunni conflict is the problem here. So it all depends on the type.
But Iran
Go
also
ahead.
harbored and cooperated with Al-Qaeda, which is also a Muslim Brotherhood, kind of more Sunni-leaning.
Who cooperate?
Iran has harbored Al-Qaeda, and
That's correct.
so why Al-Qaeda and not ISIS?
Well, I know why. ISIS definitely wants to have a caliphate that would just takes precedence over the Ayatollah and the people who support him.
But Al-Qaeda basically has the same goal. They also want a caliphate.
They do, but ISIS and Al-Qaeda differed in the sense that ISIS had a more overarching goal, and they had better means and more funding to achieve it. So ISIS scares groups like Hamas and the Iranian government. And ISIS made it clear that once they have a global caliphate, the Shia population will just be vanquished. Al-Qaeda has not made that statement. So Iran perceives Al-Qaeda as far less dangerous than ISIS. It's a matter of ideology.
So essentially, ISIS and Iran have clashing visions and mutually exclusive goals that do not allow for much long-term cooperation, and in the short term, it's anyone's guess what's going on.
Well, they certainly have the same long-term goal of turning planet Earth into a caliphate.
Sure.
But it's the way to reach that goal and the type of governance that makes them different and conflicting with each other.
Iran has announced in previously several attacks by ISIS, but they have been relatively few, and it's not clear whether it was really ISIS or some localized conflict with rebels and and the internal issues as opposed to ISIS. Iran has had issues with MEK, with other groups.
And Saudi Arabia.
yeah, but I'll be honest with you, I think Iran has a much better way of getting into Saudi Arabia than the other way around, I would say. But
well, for one thing, Iran has one of the best militaries in the world. It's number 8. It has the 8th best military just capabilities in the world. So Saudi Arabia has just a lot of reasons to fear Iran. And Iran has attacked Saudi Arabia already.
So we are seeing these competing visions of jihadist paradise on earth, jihadist utopias coming from Khomeini's camp and coming from Muslim Brotherhood backed camp. Sometimes they cooperate depending on the group, sometimes they clash, but overall we are seeing this enmeshment of different types of mentalities going at it with different rhetoric, but using similar methods of recruitment and similar levels of appeals. Who, in your opinion, which camp is more influential and more successful at recruitment? Is it Iran with its proxies, or is it the jihadists, Muslim Brotherhood conglomerate of assorted?
It's definitely those independent jihadist groups, like ISIS, like Al-Qaeda, like Boko Haram, like Al-Shabaab, who do not follow any rule and who use their own social media, their own news channels, their own videos. They definitely have more reach, more influence, and more clout. They're the ones who are just the most able to rope in new potential recruits to get them to believe in their new ideologies and dream of the caliphate. So they're definitely more able to do that than the Iranian government. But all these groups you mentioned, they're part of the GJM, the Global Jihad Movement. So it doesn't matter if there's some internal strife, if they disagree with some of the methods, some of the goals, some of the governments, some of the leadership styles. The common denominator to all these groups are number one, the use of social media, that's efficient. And number 2, the GJM is the Global Jihad Movement. And number 3 was the ultimate goal. They want to establish an Islamic system of world government, a caliphate. So you have to look at the common denominators. Sure, they clash, they kill each other, they ridicule each other, sometimes they collaborate, right? They're like a weathercock Right? You've seen those on top of a
Sure.
church, and they're like a weathercock. But the problem, Irina, is that they have common denominators, common goals.
So here's the thing, the decentralized approach of these independent groups has allowed them to develop very creative ways of appealing to the young people on a deeply emotional level, getting them involved in something greater than themselves. Whether they get disillusioned later when they're already in it is a different story, but they are recruiting through, especially ISIS, through excellent graphics, through appealing humorous content, sometimes even
Yes.
kittens, whatever you name it, wives. Iran has actually, its successes in propaganda has been more of the lobbying type in the West, lying about who they are, misleading about the nuclear deal, things of that sort. It has not been particularly great at whitewashing its internal problems, and certainly not giving positive incentive for anyone to join its ranks other than financial and power structure to its proxies in Lebanon and Houthis and whatever. But in terms of that sort of savvy recruitment, zeal of random people from around the world without a financial incentive, I just don't really see them going for that. Why hasn't Iran been able to learn from these competing ISIS-like groups in terms of recruitment? Why has it stuck to kind of a more traditional authoritarian regime, kind of ossified rhetoric and communications?
Your answer was what you said before asking me the question. Iran is not as good as other independent jihadist groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda, and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram, you name it. The ADF, we haven't talked about them, right? The Liberation Front in the Congo. See,
Sure.
Iran is not as good as those groups when it comes to propagating and diffusing beliefs. But Iran has a big advantage, a better advantage than all these groups. It has hundreds of billions of dollars. Iran can influence other groups or even other countries by funding them, by giving them the financial support and the manpower and the equipment. I wouldn't be surprised if I learn one day that Iran is training the Taliban. We don't know that. See, Iran is filthy rich. I'm talking about the government. The people are poor. I believe that the standard of living from 1979 until today, we're talking about 43 years, has increased by a few points, right? Percentage points. But the government is rich. They can influence jihadist groups. So sure, Iran needs to learn, using your word, Irina, Iran needs to learn how to better propagandize their anti-Western hatred, their pro-caliphate agenda. So it is true that a lot of countries, a lot of groups around the world do not align with what the government of Iran and the IRGC are doing. But the latter have so much money.
So they don't have to be creative. They can just buy off or intimidate.
Yes, they can. I know it's hard to believe. They can. They can. Oh, yes. Remember what I said some 30 minutes ago. The IRGC, their revenues annually exceeds $300 billion. That's not even the government, the state-owned businesses. Two different things here, Irina. We have state-owned businesses in Iran, and then we have those industries owned by the IRGC. So a lot of the media establishment tends to use the IRGC and the Iranian government interchangeably, but the IRGC is hired to protect the government. So it's a different entity. They just protect the Ayatollah and his entourage. But the IRGC is filthy rich. And they're able to influence, I mean, they can influence other jihadist groups, other countries. Only a small percentage goes into the Iranian people. It's very sad. I feel for them.
No,
You know what? You know what the Iranian people need? They need to have the Iranian version of Gandhi or
a
MLK
leader, a strong
Nelson
group.
Mandela, a leader who will galvanize the entire population
Mhm. There has
with
been a
fair
completely,
elections. That's what we need, fair elections. I don't think that a revolution will take place in Iran. That would be great. Imagine all Iranians are on the same page and they want to just lead a revolution. It's possible. But I think that the peaceful version, imagine the total opposite. We have the Ayatollah, and then we have the total opposite, like a leader that most Iranians believe in. That's the solution.
so far, unfortunately, I have not heard of anything of that sort, even being even.
Or maybe they're in jail, maybe they're in prison.
Well, that's the problem is they've had many activists certainly and dissidents who went to prison, but none of them have been so widely popular as to have had any opportunity to reach to all the different strata of society and bring them together. So far, that
No,
has
there's
not.
I can't think of one. No, there's
No.
no, I can't think of one.
No.
An armed revolution
I just don't really see it right now.
against the IRGC, against the Iranian government, against the 1 million personnel military. How are they going to do it?
The military has so far there is no buy-in to anything other than the current structure. Yes, the Shah fled and some of his people stayed and turned to Islamic Republic, but maybe some of the military would be willing to put down their weapons, peacefully surrender and join the new government. But
that's another solution, but it's not going to happen. Imagine the IRGC, you know, they wake up one day, they have an epiphany. I'm tired of you, Ayatollah, go to hell, and I'm going to join the Iranian people. I don't think the military or the IRGC or the government or the secret forces or the security forces will do that. That's another solution, but I think it's utopian.
Yeah, in most cases, there's no reason for them to do that. First of all, they'll be facing trials. Some of them may receive a pardon, but in most cases, they're violent abusers and terrorists. They have nothing but prison to awaiting for them if they surrender their power. So I don't really see what incentive they have to turn against the people, turn against the regime and join the people. The people who work for these structures, they all have a buy-in to they have an incentive to stay where they are.
So for systemic change in Iran, let me ask you a question. What's the best solution? Is it the one that I proposed, you know, to have like the Iranian version of Gandhi or Nelson Mandela?
The obstacle to that is the complete lack of unity in the population. You would need a leader who is able to speak to different ethnicities, religions, and mindsets and classes. And so far, there's been so much bigoted rhetoric among the different groups that I just don't see anyone with that leadership potential yet. Certainly not the Shah's son here. He has been largely ignoring the plights.
So we're talking about Reza Pahlavi.
Yeah, Reza Pahlavi. And as for the pro-Republican type government people, I don't even know who they are. There are many, but none of them are well known enough to really be galvanizing leadership.
Could there be some minor reforms? So I think that's what's going to happen. So I think to appease the Iranian population, I think that the government could just enact some minor reforms, lifting the veil. I don't know.
I think some factions may promise reforms to win political elections in the future, but I don't see the Khomeinis in power, and certainly not the Ayatollahs, willing to give in on any level. If anything, they'll crack down.
But they would look weak. They're going to think they're going to look weak.
Yeah, exactly. So I wanted to follow up. So this projection of power is a big thing in these jihadist communications, whether state or non-state. They want to look cool or powerful or have something to offer. Now, the interesting thing, in the United States, where life is by and large pretty good for most people, even the people who are harder off, they're much better off than in sub-Saharan Africa or someplace like that. That's much harder to do. with most people. Most people don't want to leave their home and go fight somewhere in Syria. It's their life, the standard of living is just too high, and most people are just not that ideological to go fight for some random cause. They're not that interested in, they're maybe complacent and not ambitious, but they're also not interested in discomfort and that sort of a misadventure somewhere. But nevertheless, the recruitment efforts in the US have had some successes among the jihadis. First of all, through educational system, because they trying to radicalize education from very young childhood. So people are born as basically are being raised into that mindset from very young childhood. And Iranians have started doing the same. We've heard, you may have heard about the case in Houston with that center where the young children there were pledging allegiance to Khamenei in public.
No, I didn't hear that about Houston, but the best example that I read in the literature is that Al-Shabaab, which is a Somali-based group, has managed to recruit 20 to 30 Somalis who live in the Minneapolis area. And yes, like you said, they live in the United States and they have it all. They get social programs and low-cost education, but the problem can be traced back to the main subject of our conversation. It's access to social media. So you have young Somalis who self-radicalize behind a computer screen in St. Paul or in Minneapolis, and then they leave their families, they abandon their schooling, and then they go to Somalia, they get trained, and they become killers.
It's funny because that has actually not worked with most communities. For all the rhetoric about, for instance, Palestinian jihad, people have given money, but most people have not gone to join and fight over there. For instance, in Gaza, I'm not hearing of large numbers of Americans going there to actually fight. And the funny and same thing for various other communities and assorted other causes and jihadist groups. And even the pro-Iran lobbies here, they don't move back to Iran. They do their propaganda here for money.
Well, I know the Palestinians don't try to reach out to American Palestinians, for example. See, the Palestinians have so many people in their area or nearby regions who are willing to travel there and fight for Hamas. So Al-Shabaab, on the other hand, has been very good at reaching the diaspora.
Interesting.
The Somali diaspora in North America and also in Europe. So the Palestinians are not reaching to the Palestinian diaspora just for hijra. And hijra, as you know, is the Muslim migration to Dar al-Islam, to Muslim lands. So I know Al-Shabaab does that more than the Palestinians. The Palestinians want mostly moral support and financial support from the world against the state of Israel.
They have enough fighters. But Somalis feel like these people here have something to offer them that they cannot get locally.
Exactly.
So now that you know that there are identifiable recruitment groups that are not just generic terrorists, but specific ethnic groups aiming at particular strata of diaspora, has there been any successful disruption of this communication flow or intervention with those communities? Because
you mean like
shutting
down their accounts? Like, can you give examples like shutting down their accounts?
Shutting down their accounts, infiltrating them, and subverting them, actually, which I think would be much more successful than trying to shut down accounts or need to have them pop up. Essentially, fighting information warfare on a more strategic level, causing them to turn on one another, playing those
in communication, we call that developing a counter narrative. So you have the jihadist narrative. It's like a master narrative that extols the virtues of holy warfare. And the counter narrative would just focus on the peaceful verses in the Quran and the hadiths So it is true that some of the hadith, and for the audience, a hadith is a collection of sayings, allegedly the sayings by the Prophet Muhammad. So counter narratives may work. Are they as efficient as other means of fighting jihad? I don't think so. So the success of go ahead.
I don't mean just counter narratives saying, oh, well, terrorism is bad because you get killed and, you know, it's stupid and whatever. I mean literally infiltrating these online groups by law enforcement or experts, trained, skilled experts, and literally wreaking havoc among these groups and causing them to self-destroy and from within.
That doesn't happen very often. And generally, it doesn't happen from within. Rarely, so history will tell you that rarely do we find cases whereby terrorist groups self-destroy because of internal strife, because people surrender. That was true with the Weather Underground.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Bill Ayers and his wife, that was true. They surrendered, they went to jail, but those are unique cases. The groups that we see today, especially as they grow, as they expand, are not going to self-destroy. And they're not going to be dismantled by international security agencies. And look what happened to ISIS. We dismantled ISIS in the Near East in 2019. That was 3.5 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And then the problem was shifted elsewhere. See, we're not fighting people, we're fighting an ideology.
Mm-hmm.
And ideologies will disappear if we have the proper teaching, I mean, from the cradle. We need to teach those people from the cradle what tolerance means, what democracy means, what love means.
But
now, is it going to be absolutely effective? No, you will always have people who will self-radicalize on the internet, even if they come from wealthy, educated families, even if they have a master's degree in history, in philosophy, in business. They received a liberal education. Those people can still self-radicalize behind the computer screen, but it's less likely.
But
so
we
with
don't
soft
have
power, we need soft power in addition to hard power.
We don't have control about what's going on outside our own borders. We can certainly cooperate with allies on creating better educational systems and programming and whatsoever. But if someone comes from a failed state, or if somebody is a nomad who is here and there, you can't teach them anything. You can't get a hold of them. Nobody has any particular control over them. And that's a problematic group because they're hard to pin down. They're not controllable. They're not somebody who can be educated from birth because they're already an adult with a particular mindset. What do you do to stop these people from being effective? Yes, you can try to inoculate your own population. That's of course the best defense. Right now,
I'm going to answer your question by talking about the Singaporean model.
Mm-hmm.
So Singapore is a city-state. We're talking about 5 or 6 million people, right? At the bottom tip of Malaysia. And Singapore is the perfect example of inter-religious harmony. You have a high percentage of Muslims, a high percentage of Buddhists, and a high percentage of Christians. If you are a radical preacher, pastor, or imam, and you go to Singapore, you're going to be shut down. Singapore has developed great social programs that allow people from different backgrounds to get along. So if every country followed the Singaporean model, I guarantee you that the world will be a much better place. But then look at all the failed states across different continents. Look at the corruption. There's no way you will be corrupt in Singapore, right? They're going to keep your feet to the fire. So, but if every country were like Singapore, the situation would be so much better. It did work over there.
Yes.
There's no penetration. There's no online penetration of radical propaganda. This gets shut down. But at the same time, you are free to spread a few conspiracy theories. So they're not going to shut down your Twitter account if you're a conspiracy theorist about the vaccine. So I like the pros and cons of internet regulation like we see in Singapore. that's the solution, I think. That's the best solution.
That's true, but it's also a far smaller country than, for instance, the United States with 340 million people. You can't go hunting for every preacher that's out there. There's too many of them. Although
Yeah,
they
so
also,
logistically speaking, is not what you're saying is that logistically speaking, it's less feasible, it's less possible.
yes, although what we could do is start by not bringing any new ones in, which we do on a regular basis.
How many illegals have crossed the border under Biden?
Oh, I
1,
don't
2
even mean
million?
that. I'm not even talking about open borders.
I know what
I'm
you're talking about, but yes.
giving visas to radicals from Pakistan and all these other places who come in and preach radical ideology, and then they go back. Or
You know what they're going to
back and
say to
forth.
try to shut us down? They're going to say, hey, we have the First Amendment, freedom of religion. Hey, don't discriminate, don't pick and choose. So what do we say to that?
Well, visa is certainly not a right. So those who are not US citizens, they don't have to enter the country. That would be a good start. So yeah, because of the constitutional protections, this certainly gets much trickier than with Singapore, where they have a different constitution. So so that's of course a problem. But at the end of the day, communications are communications. You can try to shift and you can try to push back. You can try to cause them problems, because right now we are the ones on the defensive. We are the ones running after them, trying to figure out these networks, playing catch up. They're the ones. Yes, some people get arrested, they get stopped if they go too far, if they're not smart while planning a crime. But the overwhelming majority does not go that far. They just spread extremist content and hateful speech and verses and hadiths and whatever else. They don't necessarily advocate violence right there openly. They draw you in and then they advocate violence somewhere else, not online. So with that sort of
So what you're
context,
saying is that they're somewhat deceptive. They have just,
if not completely deceptive, at the very least, they know where to draw a line in order not to get in trouble. So this is where I'm suggesting that it's time to start pushing back in other ways by literally deploying their method, turning them on each other, starting disinformation campaigns amongst them, just to at least cause them problems and make them less effective at doing their job.
so that's part of the counter narrative and the counter propaganda I was advocating. But again, the results have been moderate.
But have they actually tried exactly that, or have they just stuck to trying to explain why what they're doing is bad? Because as far as I see, the US government, for instance, has
It's
not.
one way to do it, but again, it's not that efficient, because once someone has been radicalized, it's hard to rewire them.
Oh,
So
no,
the
no,
best
I'm not talking
solution-
about rewiring. I'm talking about disrupting for the sake of just causing problems, not changing anybody's mind, but
So
literally.
it's what you're saying is that it's communication versus communication. So
Yes.
we tell them that what they do is bad. Do you think they're
No.
going to listen to us?
No, I'm saying exactly the opposite. Don't bother wasting time on trying to spread counter propaganda online against jihadists, because it's not that effective. Infiltrate them as if you're basically as a mole and basically cause them problems, just cause them to start fighting.
So to be a spy, yeah, I get what you mean. I think it requires a lot of
Resources, sure.
tact, a lot of experience, because infiltrating a
Precisely.
terrorist group, especially online, is not as easy as we think, because
No, I'm
they
not.
might easily detect us.
It should be trained professionals.
I don't think that will
community.
disrupt. I don't think that infiltrating them like a mole will disrupt them, especially since they're scattered across the world and they can just reform. They can just reconstitute another group elsewhere.
Oh, but the target is not to try to get them somewhere or to disrupt the group. The mission there is just to cause them difficulties in communicating and preventing them from being effective in carrying on with their agenda, not to stop them completely.
By doing what? By disrupting their accounts, by
misleading
denial.
them, by deception, by misdirection, by essentially turning one group against another, stirring
If 10
the
people
pot.
do that, that's not enough. If 10,000 people do that, that would be enough. Do we have the team? It's not a one-man army. So
Sure.
do we have a team of a lot of people willing to do that? We would need tens of thousands of people willing just to devote their time and energy to disrupting terrorist communications by infiltrating their group, being a mole, being a spy. Are people trained to do that? Because again, it's not as easy as we think. You have to receive training. You have to understand possibly the type of software in the deep web. So it's not that you're going to join a group and do your thing. I think it's a lot deeper than that.
Given the level of growth of jihad that you are suggesting, it seems to be a much better use of resources than simply shutting down accounts time after time, or simply sanctioning these entities, which doesn't really do much. We have hundreds of thousands of intelligence officers who a lot of the times perform duplicative functions and clash with each other. Perhaps if some of that could be relegated towards that specific task, there could be some progress made.
I think if a lot of people are willing to be trained, if we motivate those people to do that, to cause internal disruptions, I think that will work. It will work temporarily.
It certainly works in our with disinformation campaigns aimed at state actors. Not that we have done that particularly well, but Ukraine and Russia, we have seen very successful examples. I don't see why terrorist organizations at the end of the day consist of people who are deceivable, who have emotions, who have motivations, grievances, and who are not, they don't always know what's going on the other end. So they can be deceived, manipulated, and misled just like anybody else.
No, that's true. Yeah, I have nothing else to say. So if we have that many people, so this will require a huge team, international team that we have to train.
Of course, it should be an international. I mean,
we will have to train,
coalitions,
right?
For all sorts of things, for all sorts of types of intelligence training and so forth. But we need to keep up with the times. We cannot operate as if we're still fighting Al Qaeda on September 12th.
No, absolutely.
We need to be integrating what we have learned from various types of, military intelligence scenarios and various types of psychological warfare, and applying.
We will have to measure up with the new terrorist methods. We haven't talked about video games yet. That's part of communication in global
jihad. That was actually my next question.
How do we prevent would-be terrorists from being radicalized or giving instructions through video games? Very difficult to prevent that, because they can circumvent any rule. They can use different role-playing types. So they can find a lot of ways to engage in terrorism or terrorist instruction. So just to answer your few questions here, it will require a gigantic counter-terrorist team who will have to be savvy about all kinds of information and communication technologies to be able to prevent terrorism from growing in the digital realm, in cyberspace, right, in the public sphere, because we're talking about the public sphere. So, and terrorist groups will find other ways. Once they know that we wise up to them, they will find other ways to be creative in the public sphere, in cyberspace, in video games. And then we will have to wise up. So it's almost like playing a chess game. As they make a move, we make a counter move. And then they make a new move, we make a counter move. So it doesn't stop. Do we have the motivation, and do we have enough people to keep up with them?
Well, the people are
right now. We don't.
Well, pure body count we have. Redirecting and retraining them towards that specific task is obviously going to take time. But if you don't recognize that ideological warfare should be a priority, you can kill any number of terrorists, but then they'll recruit new bodies. Then prevention, as you said earlier, is much more successful at the end of the day. And causing difficulties and making these people less effective at propagating content will make that less of a problem for us. The less they are effective at propagating content, the less content we have to fight.
Yes.
But I wanted to follow up on your question about video games. Do you think this potential for using video games and all sorts of, these types of endeavors, do you think the level of violence or desensitization to violence from video games, is that going to be a boon, an advantage, or an obstacle to terrorism recruitment?
I'm afraid it is a boon to terrorist recruitment because the fastest growing industry today, especially in the stock market, is the video game industry. So no video game maker, no giant in that industry will reduce their production of violent video games and role-playing video games and all that because it's so many billions of dollars.
Mm-hmm.
And it benefits the industry and it benefits terrorist groups because they can use video games as a platform to recruit people. And I can give you an example that happened 7 years ago, the Paris terrorist attacks. They happened on November 13th, 2015. And for those of you who remember, 130 people died within a few hours in Paris. And some of the instructions were actually given through video games. So it is a boon to terrorist groups. Can we prevent that? Hardly, especially since the video game industry wants to produce more and more game and expand their horizons. It is the fastest growing industry, much more than Hollywood and Bollywood and Colombia and the music industry. I should have invested years ago.
Yeah, you may want to write a book specifically about video games and their role in all of this, because it sounds like it's just a disaster waiting to happen. Surprisingly, it hasn't been worse than it already is. How much of that of those video games, by the way, stay in kind of Western or relatively wealthy countries, maybe the Gulf countries and so forth, and how many end up in developing countries, in failed states like sub-Saharan countries?
I don't think that the video game industry is that popular in failed states like those of Africa that we discussed 30 minutes ago. Social media is getting popular there, but I don't think video games are as popular as they are in Asia and North America and Europe. See, those three continents, I mean, are the continents where the video game industry, is the most popular. So as today, though, it doesn't go to South America as much or to Africa.
So basically that means whatever the focus is going to be, it's going to be on relatively developed countries, and that's where that's going to be most of the problem, whereas for everybody else it's going to be something more conventional, at least for the time being.
It can be a problem in poor regions, like, imagine a country like Bolivia or Paraguay or Burkina Faso or Mali. Because the video game industry is less popular there, but that doesn't mean it's not happening.
Sure.
So sure. I mean, for those people there who have access to video games, they can just convert to jihadist ideas.
I mean,
if they're being radicalized.
The horrifying thought is the futuristic prospects for all of that, of creating entire bot networks of radicals that are zombified and that are connected to each other, like the way it's occasionally done for some operations, and then act in concert simultaneously, large numbers of people, not just a few people here and there.
The concerts,
mass radicalization, almost like a mass psychosis, kind of mass indoctrination through these through that sort of access. I mean, that could be another front in that type of battle, for instance.
But definitely, it has happened. And again, it keeps growing and growing.
So we are seeing that the terrorists are finding creative ways, and at least the law enforcement seems to be lagging behind. Yes, they they become quite excellent and quite proficient once they learn some new method, but how quickly can they catch up? And is there the sense of emerging threats and emerging counter threats, emerging preventive tactics for new fronts? That I think is a field that is somewhat underdeveloped at the very least. We have maybe started to learn to think like terrorists, but we have not started yet thinking ahead of terrorists.
Well, just like jihadist groups and terrorist groups are patient, they don't give up. We have to be patient. We should not give up. So that's is the same metaphor of the chess game. You know, they make a move, we make another move, they make a counter move, we make a counter move. So we have to keep up and wise up with our enemy. So our enemy will never relent. And unfortunately, just like you and I and billions of people in the world enjoy social media and whatever the World Wide Web can offer, it's also a boon to terrorist groups. And the premise of my book is that the more effective the digital media, the more effective the communication in global terrorism or global jihad. So it is the parallel globalization of terror. So we have social media for good purposes, and the same social media can be used for ill purposes. So it is the parallel globalization of terror.
Now,
and it keeps getting worse.
Now, speaking of globalization, most Americans don't pay attention to events going on in sub-Saharan Africa. And that was a question basically recently asked me, but I'm going to turn it back to you now, which is how do you convey to Americans why Africa as the next potential front for the explosion of global jihad? Why should it matter to Americans? Why should we be paying attention and figuring out how to what comes next?
We should be paying attention to what's going on in Africa, specifically sub-Saharan Africa, because even though Boko Haram and Al-Shabaab and other local African groups have never targeted the Western Hemisphere or Europe, they are fomenting the global jihad movement there, and they're churning out jihadists who can create other jihadists where we live. So if we let the movement of global jihad prosper in a place like Africa, it's going to get bigger and bigger, and it will proliferate. It will spread like wildfire to other regions. So yes, it's 6,000, 7,000, 8,000 miles away, but over time they will create people, killing machines that will affect us, Westerners. So it's not affecting us today, but it will in the future.
Now, there is one issue that I've been struggling with, which is the terrorists know their own talking points and selling points, and the caliphate, the vision of the caliphate that they're selling to their recruits very well. The West previously also knew very well what it was selling to anybody who was coming here or to the world at large. But in recent years, due to polarization and bureaucratic infighting, it's very hard to see what kind of message are we sharing about ourselves between the woke culture and self-hatred and all sorts of infighting. How do we deliver an image that can be effective against whatever version of a theoretical caliphate the jihadists are trying to present?
So who's we? You say, so how do we, so are you talking about the conservative, American exception?
Americans, Europeans, and their allies in other countries.
So those people against the woke left. Definitely. So the we does not include the woke left.
Against the extremists as a whole. How do we create how do we get back to a unified vision of the West that will be an effective response to the recruitment effort? What are we selling, in other words? What is it that we are selling today? Not 20 years ago, not during the Cold War, but now. What principles?
And I contemplate, great question. I like your question, Irina. I contemplate your question on a weekly basis. So how can Western countries, how can Westerners, how can people who are reasonable, who understand jihad, how can they get on the same page, get united? It's not happening, and it won't happen. So I go back to Europe a few times a year, and they always criticize America. So America is too woke, they say. America is becoming unreasonable. So depending on where you live, a lot of people in the West are not on the same page, even though they understand the threat of jihad. So how can we unify the West? Is that going to happen? A lot of Westerners are not on the same page. They may be conservative, they may be afraid of Islam, but they don't like Donald Trump, for example. So it is impossible to unify the West unless, and let me underline unless a jihadist group like ISIS or the Muslim Brotherhood, unless there is a major attack. Imagine another 9/11 on a much higher scale that will wake up Westerners to the point of joining forces and say, enough. We need to be on the same page. We need to be united and fight a real danger. This is not a joke. It's a real danger.
We've had the 9/11 here. We've had multiple attacks around Europe. We've had, we've had people suffering in attacks in different parts of the world because America.
Are they sufficient to wake people up? Is that sufficient to wake people up?
I
remember 9/11, so do you.
Sufficient. How many attacks would it take? What is sufficient? What percentage has to suffer for it?
What does it take to wake people up?
Exactly.
It would take a major 9/11. But don't believe for a second that the West will be united against jihad. That would be great. Some of it is united against jihad. But, you and I and other people, we know that we've been criticized. We've been called racist, Islamophobes, even though we're being rational. We don't make fun of Islam. We respect most of the Muslims because those are moderate and peaceful. We don't respect jihadists, and yet we don't get the respect from some other Westerners, because they have a different understanding, they have a different dream, they have a different goal.
And this is what extremists exploit.
What the future will be.
This is, no matter how divided the extremists are, they understand us better than an average person, not an expert, but how an average person understands them. And they exploit these divisions, they exploit these differences, and they certainly like when people turn on, in the US or in Europe, turn on each other.
Yes, I guess it would. I don't know what to do to get people to wake up. I mean, imagine a 9/11 on a much higher scale. I think that will wake people up, that's for sure. And then it will be temporary, and then will be people. It's like the wave. You have a crest, and then it recedes. You have a crest, and then it receives. So 9/11 will get us on a crest. So we're going to wake up, we're going to be unified. It's going to be temporary, and then we'll just fall back to our old habits, and then we'll be receding. So I'm afraid it's a cycle. That's the problem. It's a bad cycle.
I guess the only long-term solution then is going back to what you said from the very start, education, creating an educational system, an educated public that can critically assess information and will be less
and teaching
vulnerable.
Teaching love and tolerance, because the Quran, for example, has a lot of hateful verses, but it has peaceful verses too. So teaching young Muslims that the Quran was put together in the 7th century, a few decades after the Prophet Muhammad died. So just providing new interpretation, new social, historical, contextual interpretations of the Quran. We call it hermeneutics. Hermeneutics is the study of interpretation. So imagine every Muslim country, every Muslim community focusing on hermeneutics in the Quran. That's a great step in the right direction. Is it happening though?
To some extent, but not everywhere, and certainly not in those places most affected by jihadists.
No.
Yeah, it's not, yeah.
But we do have solutions. I think this conversation has been very productive. We do have solutions. They don't depend on us. It's not a 2-people army. It would take, I think people need to wake up. Number one, people need to wake up. Number two, in Muslim countries, for example, to counter jihad, There needs to be better education, a better value system, just from the parents, from the community, from the teachers, right, from the local authorities. But is it happening? Is it going to happen?
It's complicated. Some countries are certainly taking top-level measures to enforce that, but on a social level, there is a generational divide between kind of old school mentality that's ingrained with the old educational system and the new younger people. So that's going to be, complicated process. Certainly not going to be an overnight process.
At the same time, a lot of young people become jihadists. See,
because the
over 80% of the new recruits, over 80% of the new recruits are people under the age of 25. See, they're young people, young jihadists, young minds. They go to school. So it's a very complex problem. It is not happening right now, given the demographics. 10 years ago, Irina, 10 years ago, we had 1.5 billion Muslims. Today, we have 2 billion. So Islam is the fastest growing religion in the world. Imagine that only 1% of Muslims are jihadists. We know it's higher than that, but imagine a situation where imagine a world where only 1% of Muslims are jihadists. You know what that means, Irina? That's 20 million people. 1%, 20 million people. People don't talk about numbers sufficiently. But we know that the percentage is more than 1%.
Is there an accurate estimate of how many memberships do those jihadists?
The best estimate we get are from the Pew Research Center, the Pew institution based in Washington, D.C., and they survey Muslims, sometimes up to 40,000 Muslims. I remember that survey from 2013, April 2013, Pew surveyed 38,000 Muslims. Do you know what the response was to one of the questions? What do you think of suicide bombings? 28%, Irina. Whoa, 28% of the respondents said, yes, I fully support or partially support suicide bombings. That's like 300 to 400 million people if you scale that up to the whole population.
Was that in the United States or was it an international poll?
That was international, not in the US, international, like Egypt, Pakistan. We're talking about 38,000 Muslims. So, it's tough. We do have solutions, but given the current trends and current demographics, there is a reformation movement in both directions. Let's talk about reformation. We have a reformation towards peace and a secular democracy. So we have those people in Iran. And then we have a reformation, some of those people, right? Maybe a third, maybe half of the Iranian population. And then we have a reformation movement towards more radicalism in the religion. So we call it the GDT, the global divergence theory. So we have a reformation going both directions.
Sure.
More radicalism and more peaceful. Don't ask me the percentage of who belongs to what party.
Sure.
1% is 20 million people. We know it's more than 1%. When I say that to my students, they listen to me. They calm down, they sit down, they listen to me.
And that's why ideology is the most important tool or weapon, depending on how.
That's what Karl Marx. You know what Karl Marx said, Irina? Give me a child until age 5, and he will be mine forever. That's right. If it starts before age 5, I mean, if you start from the cradle, their mind is like Play-Doh, it's malleable. So if it's all good, you teach love and tolerance, that's the #1 solution. But is it happening? In some places, I know some families want to do that. Maybe they don't dare because they know the police will raid their houses. That's what my Iranian friend told me yesterday. Yes, they own businesses, they own the industry. Even if you own your own house, they told me the police can just, they don't need a warrant. They can just enter your house. We've learned that you're teaching your children the government is bad. Try to do that in Iran and see what happens to you. maybe a lot of Muslim families want to teach tolerance and love. Are they allowed to do it? What would it take for them to do it? What sacrifice would they endure for them to do that? So it's a very complex problem, and you and I understand it very well. We have a few solutions, but it's not up to us. It's up to them.
Of course. Well, thank you so much for your contribution.
What a great interview. I'm giving you a big hug.
Thank you. I can't wait to read your book. Once the new book is finished, please do let me know. I'd love to discuss
The one on
it.
Africa, yeah, the jihad, yeah.
Yeah, once it's
You can get the book about this interview here on Communication and Global Jihad by Outrage
yes,
for you and the audience.
absolutely. Yes, please. Please check it out. Is it available on Amazon or
Yeah,
through...
absolutely.
Excellent. So I'll be certainly grabbing mine, but I also want to certainly read the new book because of the recent developments in sub-Saharan Africa that I think is going to be very timely to current events. And I encourage everyone else to do the same, to look up some of the other books from the past as well. For everyone who's been watching, this has been a program with Dr. Matusitz. He was discussing his works on communications and global jihad in his upcoming book dealing with the problem of terrorism in sub-Saharan Africa. Please stay tuned. The Washington Outsider Report will be back on the Coalition Radio next week, Tuesday night at 9 p.m. as always. And thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Irina. Always a pleasure.